Alright, hopefully you've already watched the presentation assigning the informative speech, and we can now move into the persuasive speech, which will also double as our presentation on the delivery characteristics. Now remember, for the informative speech, the delivery characteristics are very minor and make up only 10% of the grade. But for the persuasive speech, they'll make up 1/3 of the grade. That's why delivery is going to be a much bigger issue in this presentation. But a lot of the stuff is going to stay the same. So let's start with the basics. So let's move now to look at the dates for the persuasive speech, the biggest speech in the entire class. Now these things do back up into each other, so make sure that if you're at all behind on the informative speech that you don't allow that to then cascade into messing up your performance on the persuasive speech. Keep those deadlines in front of you. It's one of the biggest problems with taking the class in an online format that rushes you through so much. So the first deadline, the due dates are going to be for the rough outline, same process as the informative, due by 8 p.m. on July 16th. And just like with the informative, even if you miss that deadline, I still need a rough outline so that I can give you some feedback, and that's going to help to prevent you from making some big mistakes later on. So remember, minimum for a rough outline is the thesis and the 3 main points, the preview you're going to go for. But the more you give me, the more feedback I can give you, and the safer and more comfortable you'll feel about the grade you're going to get on this biggest assignment in the class. Now this has an additional little extra element thrown into it, which is a special quiz. So normally our quizzes are only on Sundays at 8 p.m. This is one extra quiz, so you'll still have a Sunday quiz this week, but in addition you'll have this quiz due by 8 p.m. on July 18th. What this quiz will include is simply a poll in which every student in the class will respond to every other student's thesis statement. So let's say, for example, you're going to persuade us to become vegans or something like that. Your thesis statement would go into the quiz. Every other student responds to it on a scale from strongly disagree to strongly agree. And then we see where the class is. And that gives you a sense as to the kind of audience response you would get from your presentation. It also lets you know that if your audience already generally agrees with you, that you can maybe push them even further than they might have been willing to go in the first place. So those are due by the 18th, and then I'll make the results of them available to all the students so you can see how your topics did. Now the feedback and discussion will really get going on July 19th. The reason I've asterisked that is obviously if your outline has any major problems, I'll spot them immediately when you turn it in on the 16th, and I'll give you feedback quicker. But the real discussion about how you're going to craft that final good speech is going to start on the 19th. The speeches themselves are due on July 23rd, once again by 8 p.m., same as always. And this includes the video and the packet. And this is a good reminder for the informative as well as the persuasive speech. The packet includes technically 4 things, but one of them you'll have already done, which is the rough outline. The other 3 parts are the formal notes. Now remember, the formal notes is a revised version of the outline that looks really nice. It's the kind of thing that you would actually hand out if you were to give this at a presentation to your company or at a press briefing or something like that. It's beautiful, resume quality. The speaking materials, on the other hand, is whatever works for you. So some people like doing handwritten notes. Some people just make a bigger, larger fonted version of the formal notes. Fine, but they should be different. And the reason I want to see them is that I can often spot some delivery problems that are caused by the notes that you used. So if you do happen to do something handwritten, or if you mark up a regular printed sheet, just go ahead and take some photos of it with your phone and send me photos of your speaking materials. And then, of course, the bibliography, which a lot of people will attach to their formal notes as well. So these are the key requirements and due dates for the persuasive speech. Now here are the changes. First, we're going to have the same elements of the introduction, so there's still 5 parts of the intro, but notice that each of them are now worth only 3 points, because we're assuming you know how to handle them. Same thing is true of the body. The body stays exactly the same, with one difference. We're going to be requiring, in addition to the normal elements of the body, a specific behavior. When it comes to a persuasive speech, I require that this speech asks the audience not just to agree with you or change their mind, but actually to do something. That could be something such as writing a letter to a congressional representative, signing a petition, donating money or time, and so on. The argument has to be focused on a real world behavior that the actual people in our class could do to try to help your situation. The transitions are once again going to be required, but are worth less. Same thing with the conclusion. Basically, we're assuming you already know how to do these parts, so we're giving them less value this time around. The delivery, however, is now worth 5 times as much as it was before. This entire speech is worth 150 points. 50 of it is delivery. Note the change in the focus. First, the structural elements are all there, but worth less. A specific action is the goal of your speech, and delivery is much more important. Now don't worry, I'm going to give you plenty of advice on how to handle the changes in delivery. The really good news is that the structure for this speech is virtually identical depending on how you approach the actual elements of the speech. So you'll have the introduction, attention getter, listener relevance, speaker credibility, thesis and preview, same as last time, as well as the same elements of the conclusion, a review, a restatement of a thesis, and a clincher. But because it's your second speech, we're now going to allow even more flexibility in how you break the rules. I want all of these elements showing on the screen right now in your outline, but I'm going to allow you to break some rules by merging them together if you think it makes sense to do so. For example, sometimes for an attention getter, people might give a personal story that not only shows their speaker credibility, but also shows the audience why they might care about the topic. A really sad example I had of this in a class one time was a student who opened her speech by telling a story about how she came home as a little kid to find her father dying of a heart attack, and how she had to perform CPR on him. Now that immediately gave her credibility, made the audience care about the topic and care about her, and definitely got their attention. So that one element performed all 3 of those functions in the attention getter. In her outline, it would have been labeled that way, that all 3 parts were happening at the same time. So that's something you could think about too, by merging 1 or 2 of these steps together. Also, the bookending process might be a little different because sometimes the clincher for this type of speech might not refer back to the attention getter, but will instead refer back to a key argument in the speech. So the attention getter in the speech that I gave you last time, the symbiosis speech, started by talking about the parasites we have on our body that we actually need to be there, and then closed by reminding us about that same factoid. But in a persuasive speech, maybe somewhere in the 3rd main point, I might make a really powerful argument. Instead of repeating my attention getter, I might close by repeating or referencing that argument once again, because I know that's the one that's really going to make the difference. So again, you can play with these rules a little bit as long as you're doing it purposefully and doing it well. Also, for the transitions, for this speech, we still want them to close and open each main point, but you're going to want to do it even more argumentatively. Meaning, you're assuming the audience doesn't agree with you. So it's not just that you want to make sure they understand you from point to point, it's that when you finish a point, you want to really emphasize that you've persuaded them about something. For example, you might finish by saying, now that we've proven why this particular company has done such a bad thing, let's move on to try to figure out why they keep doing it. Notice how that's much more argumentative than simply telling you what my main points were about. Now for the body of the speech. This is the part that the chapter I had you read actually helps you a lot more with than for the informative speech, because it gives you several traditional patterns of persuasive speaking. I'm going to focus on 2 of them, one of which we'll actually use for another speaking activity later in the class. First, the problem, cause, solution format. This is a great useful technique for persuasive speaking because those 3 words are your 3 main points. It makes organizing the speech really clear. Your first main point explains exactly what's happening and why it's bad. The second main point explains how things got to be that way or why they keep happening. And then your solution step says, here's what the audience can do to fix it. It's a really useful way to set up a lot of speeches. The number one reason to include the cause in this type of format is that when audiences fully understand the cause of a problem, they might be more likely to accept your solution. So cause is useful, but not always required. Let's say, for example, many of you might have had this experience where one of your parents has a computer that is not running well. They're having all kinds of problems with it. And if you're like me, your parents have done that to their own computer with the garbage they've loaded onto it. So the problem is the computer's running slow, certain programs aren't working, the computer crashes every now and then, stuff like that. The cause would be finding out about all those terrible toolbars they've loaded onto their browser every time they've gone to a new site. So, for example, with my parents, luckily this was a long time ago, my parents loaded on a whole bunch of coupon toolbars that gave them little notices whenever there was a coupon on a travel thing that they were interested in. And any of you who know anything about computers know that a lot of those toolbars are terrible. In fact, the one I'm going to use as my solution is so bad that Apple even calls it a malware, meaning that it's not really a virus, but it's so close it might as well be a virus. So the cause is all these toolbars running in the background, eating up all kinds of resources on the computer. And then the solution is, the next time you install something, make sure you check to see everything that is being installed is something you actually want. So when you download a particular program or get an update on Java, you uncheck that box that says that you want to add another toolbar. So notice that my speech, a very brief version of it, talked about the problem, here's why my computer doesn't work, cause, here's the actual reasons why the computer isn't working anymore, solution, uninstall that stuff and make sure you don't install new ones. Now, an older technique, one that's actually more classical, and it's the one we're going to use, will probably be familiar to you if you've watched any infomercials, because just about every infomercial uses this technique. It's called Monroe's Motivated Sequence. And it's kind of related to the problem, cause, solution, but it has one unique difference that's really cool, and it's actually very useful, and you'll see why infomercials use it. It begins with an attention step, kind of like an attention getter. But usually the attention step does something to set the stage. For example, it might show people going on a vacation or people just about ready to leave the house for work in the morning or something like that. It just sets you up to let you know what you're about to hear about. Then we move to the need, and this is similar to the problem step in a problem, cause, solution speech. You point out something bad, either something that goes wrong an awful lot, something that could be better than it currently is, and so on. For any of you who have watched any infomercials, this is always the comical part right at the beginning where we see regular people failing to do everyday tasks, like they try to open a carton of milk and it explodes everywhere, or they try to get something out of the microwave and they burn their hands and comically stick their fingers in their mouth and stuff like that. Or one of my favorite animated GIFs of all time, this one right here where a kid spills some root beer and blows up the planet. Yeah, spilling root beer is bad, but it's not quite as bad as these people in the action always make it seem to be, right? They always overreact. Well, what they're doing is they're emphasizing the need. They're saying, hey, this thing is really problematic, and don't you hate it when this happens? Then we go to what is called the satisfaction step. This part is pretty frequently misunderstood by people because it sounds like solution. It's not. It's more a list of options. That's the best way to take that down into your notes. In the satisfaction step, you explain to the audience the various ways in which they could solve the problem. You're just giving them a list of options. So it could be, hey, I've got a whole bunch of different versions of the same product. You should try one of them and that would solve your problem. But more often than not, it's a list of alternatives. Like let's say, for example, I've got a really bad headache. If I were to ask you in a traditional class right now, we would almost immediately get 5 or 6 totally different answers. Some of you who are really health conscious might know that just drinking water can sometimes help alleviate headaches. Some of you who might have had migraines and stuff will have your preferred medication. You'll have your favorites like Excedrin or Advil depending on your own history. Others of you will say, hey, caffeine can also help, or taking a nap. Now notice those aren't just 3 of the same product, it's a bunch of different choices, different alternatives you might go through. Now if you're an advertiser, the solution is going to be one of those, but you're throwing it out there with all of the rest of the options so the audience feels like you're giving them a fair shot. Then, in the next step, visualization, you go back through all those options and show them why other options don't work as well. So, for example, let's say I have a headache and you say I should just drink more water. And I say, yeah, but I've already drank water, I'm just fine. Or maybe I don't have water with me right now or something like this. I could point out reasons why that solution's not as effective. Or you say, hey, you should drink some caffeine. And I might respond, I can't, I'm pregnant or allergic or whatever. And then you might say, hey, have Excedrin. And I'd say, oh, no, that tends to make my stomach really upset. But then you say, hey, try Advil. And it's got this special coating that makes you not have upset stomach and will help with your headache. Notice you've now pitched me your particular choice that works better than all the other ones. So satisfaction is connected to visualization. You actually walk us through why your solution is going to work well. Then, after you've done all that, you close by calling us to action, encouraging to take a specific step. In the infomercials, this is always when we get this big thing, right? Where they show us exactly how much it costs, how to call or where to send our money, what kind of money is acceptable, what store we can buy it at, and so on. Once you've got us persuaded, it's the key moment to tell us, okay, now go do something with it. Later in the term, I'm going to have you actually do a quick little video of you making up one of these infomercials using these 5 steps. But you could also use it for the persuasive speech. The way that it would work is that your attention step would be in your intro, and then your 3 main points would be need, satisfaction, and then visualization, and clincher would be call to action. So it fits the same format that we've been using. But it's still possible that you could use the format from the last speech, where you simply use 3 different main points. Once again, they would still need to be distinct, balanced, and built up. A great example of this would be if you wanted to convince the audience to exercise more. You could simply give 3 different arguments as to why exercise is beneficial. They wouldn't necessarily need to be a problem, a cause, and a solution. You could simply say, hey, exercise is a great way to meet people, and exercise is also a really good lifelong habit for all these parts of your body. And then finally, exercise is great because it relieves stress too. So 3 different arguments for the same solution. So that's some different choices you have in terms of organizing the speech as you go. Now, for the persuasive speech, we're assuming that the audience is going to be fairly hostile, meaning that the research that's required is going to be of an even higher standard. Once again, all the citations are still required in all 3 places. You've got to say them out loud, they have to be in the outline, and they need to be included in a bibliography. Once again, the minimum is at least 1 footnote per main point, but I would encourage you to use more than just 1. They are graded once again as part of the main point, and I've got a much higher standard of evidence, meaning I'm looking for something that isn't just a news report. Try to find us scientific or economic journals or anything related to your topic that's very persuasive because of the quality of the research. Simply finding something in a news source isn't nearly as powerful as finding something in an academic journal. So source quality would include things like, just like last time, make sure you're not using a biased source, or if you do find a biased source that actually agrees with a position that is the opposite of what you think they normally would, that's pretty powerful. For example, David Brooks is a fairly well-known conservative writer, but if he wrote something about the healthcare bill that he liked, I might use that saying, hey, audience, if you don't like the healthcare bill because you're conservative, here's another conservative who actually thinks the healthcare bill is a good thing. And that could be persuasive. But notice that as I presented it, I would actually tell the audience that. I wouldn't just say, here's some random fact from some random guy in some random magazine. I would say, here's David Brooks, a conservative writer who normally doesn't like many liberal causes, but he thinks this particular policy is a good policy. By telling the audience that, I might persuade them because I showed them I did my homework and that I'm using evidence they would normally accept. So integrate and explain your information. The example video I give you of the persuasive speech will also use a couple cases of this. Visual aids for this speech are optional. You can use them if you want to, but they aren't required. And if you do use a visual aid you get from a source, feel free to count it as one of your footnotes. All right, now into delivery. As I mentioned, that's what the main focus of this presentation is telling you what kinds of things constitute good delivery, and we're going to be focusing on 10 characteristics. The characteristics also can be broken down into 2 major categories, vocal and non-vocal. Vocal means voice, so things you're using your voice to do. Non-vocal means everything else, so the non-vocals would include what most people call non-verbals. That's not exactly a perfect definition, but we'll talk about that in a moment. Vocally, I look at things like volume. Are you loud enough that we can hear you, But that doesn't mean you should yell or be too pronounced. We want your voice to be even and conversational and confident. Those are the key standards I tend to go for. If you tend to go too soft, we not only can't understand you, but we might begin to doubt your sincerity about a topic. Conversely, if you go too loud, you might seem to be trying to bully us into agreeing with you. So simply try to speak with confidence and command. Articulation and pronunciation are really key details. The reason that there's two different terms is that they actually mean two different things. Articulation means clarity. How clearly are words coming out of your face? Pronunciation means, are you saying the words correctly based on how your culture thinks they should be presented? Here's some quick examples. The very first one I've just presented there is but versus butter. Now notice that when I pronounced both words, you probably didn't have trouble with it. But is how we say the first word, and butter is how we say the second word. Notice how butter doesn't seem to have any actual T's in it. Now some of you who might be thinking about this right now will say, yeah, but it's actually supposed to be pronounced butter. Yeah, I guarantee that if you go into a grocery store and ask for butter, they'll look at you like you're playing a joke on them. In our society, this word is pronounced with a slight slur, butter. The second word that I've presented there is purposely misspelled to help emphasize the difference. If I say that I loved going to the circus because I liked seeing all of the aminals, my articulation was flawless. I very clearly said aminals, but I pronounced the word incorrectly. The final one is the word schedule, or schedule. It depends on where you're from. If you're from the United States, you say schedule, but in Britain, they would pronounce that schedule. Now, if I said schedule in America, once again, people would think I was playing a joke on them. That's the difference between articulation and pronunciation. Articulation is clarity, and pronunciation is the culturally agreed pronunciation of the word. Then we go to rate and pauses. Rate has to do with how quickly you speak, and pauses is when you choose to stop speaking. Now, the key here is that they work together. People who speak quickly can often get away with it because they have well-placed pauses. Those pauses help to break up ideas and give the audience time to process through what they've said. On the other hand, if you speak too slowly and give us giant pauses in unusual places in the sentence, it sounds like you're talking down to us or that you don't even know what you're talking about. So remember, try to make sense of how rate and pauses work together. Emotion and enthusiasm are another good set. Emotion is the actual mood you're expressing, and enthusiasm is how much of that mood. So if I were to be happy, that's fine, that's an emotion. Enthusiasm says that I would be really happy, or ecstatic, or maybe just mildly happy, or content. That's a key issue. Most speakers do a good job of picking the right emotion, but have to work a little harder at picking the exact right enthusiasm level. You can especially see this in people who are brand new on newscasts. They tend to be a little too high on the enthusiasm scale, even though they've got the right emotion. So what I'm looking for you in these speeches is that you seem to care about the topic and that your emphasis gets put in the right topics. A common problem people have is that they present every part of their speech as if it's the most important argument, or as if every part of it is filled with emotion, when let's face it, some parts of your speech aren't going to be fraught with peril. So you might need to just mellow out during some parts and then really punch it at other parts of the speech. The final vocal characteristic is called verbal garbage, and I know that sounds mean, but that's actually the technical term for it. Verbal garbage are those filler noises or words that we use that don't actually add anything to the presentation. On the one side, you might have phrases that are boring or lackadaisical. Things like, you know what I'm saying, I mean, right, yeah. Those things tend to just fill in. That's not something you want to do because it's wasted space. Conversely, some people, when they feel nervous, will fill every available moment with sound. Things like where they'll simply fill in the gaps between ideas with noises. When this happens, it's usually because you're having trouble composing, and the best way to approach that is to fix your rate and pauses. And, when in doubt, go back and fix your speaking materials because they're clearly causing you some trouble. Remember, verbal garbage is a key giveaway that you don't feel very prepared about your presentation. So that wraps up the vocal side of things. Now let's switch over to the non-vocal. Non-vocal, or sometimes called non-verbal, simply means those things that don't have a specific symbolic meaning, but are more about the visual presentation. The first of these, and the most commonly misunderstood, is gestures. Now, when I say commonly misunderstood, all of you know how to gesture. I guarantee you do. I guarantee that some of you have actually been on the telephone with somebody and gestured while talking to them on the telephone. They couldn't see you, but you still did it. You still used hand gestures. Those gestures are natural to you. You've been learning how to do them your whole life. You've been watching other people do them your whole life. But for some reason, when people give a public speech, they often lock themselves down and then they end up engaging in some really weird kind of fluttery gestures instead of simply allowing their hands to naturally do what they already know how to do. This is something that people who study public speaking have been examining for a long time. They even used to have diagrams and methods by which you could actually measure exactly where your gestures are supposed to be. I'm not going to do that with you. But I do like this image because it actually shows a pretty natural gesture. This is part of the reason why I want the videos to show your whole body, or at least from the waist up, because most gestures should happen from the waist up. Anything else seems kind of throwaway, almost like that little throwaway gesture that kids do when they get told they can't have the keys for the car this weekend. We don't want them to seem like your arms are flapping at your sides, but instead to deliberately move around the room. And keep your hands away from one another. A common problem people will have with note cards is when they bring their hands together, they'll start playing with the note cards, manipulating the edges, maybe even putting them out of order without realizing it. The same thing is true of putting your hands on a podium or in your pockets. As soon as you put your hands near something else, they'll probably start fidgeting. So try to keep your hands separated so you don't seem defensive. Now, eye contact. Because we're giving the speech in a video format, that eye contact basically means being able to look at the camera. Now, in a real audience, we'd want you to be doing some different things, but let's just focus on how that camera would work, and then I'll drop in the traditional stuff in a moment. My 3 rules are up, at, and around. Looking up simply means I want you to be spending more time looking at the camera, right up from your notes, than you are looking at your notes. That's a key issue because the audience will otherwise feel really disconnected from the speech, and that's especially bad in a video presentation. In a real-life presentation, the more we expect a manuscript, the more forgiving we'd be on this standard. But in a video, simply watching you read a sheet of paper will probably really disconnect us from you. At means that when you look up, you should actually be looking at the camera, or in a real audience, actually looking at people. Every now and then I've had students who have gotten some really bad advice where people told them that when they looked up, if they were nervous, they should look over the heads of people in the room, or to look at their foreheads instead of their eyes. This is a really bad technique because you're basically talking the person into feeling more nervous, and the people in the audience will know that you're not actually connecting with them. The reason to look at people is to see how you're doing. You can see if they're confused, if they're liking it, if they're disagreeing with you on a particular point, and then you can adjust the speech accordingly, but only if you're getting that connection. And then finally, this one doesn't apply to the videos, but would apply to a regular class, around. The most common mistake that people make once they get comfortable looking up is they tend to favor only 1 or 2 members of the audience. Remember, in a real audience, you want to try to serve as many people as possible by slowly working your way across the room. Fidgeting. As I've already mentioned under gestures, this is something we don't want you to see you do with your hands, but we also don't want to see you do it with any other part of your body. For example, your feet moving around. Now, even if we can't see your feet, we can still tell by the position of your back and shoulders what's happening with your legs. So try to keep your feet fairly comfortable. You don't have to stand ramrod straight, but at the same time you shouldn't be fidgeting and shifting around too much either. It tends to indicate and broadcast that you're nervous about the speech you're giving. Poise and posture are also related. Common mistakes that I tend to see here is that some folks tend to lean forward a little bit too much or to tilt their head downward. That's part of the reason I'd like your videos to be as close to eye level as you can be so that it becomes as natural as giving a normal speech. Also, I've noticed that some folks will sometimes lean from side to side. For example, tilting one part of their body lower than the other part of the body. That again tends to make somebody seem a bit submissive and a little bit subservient, as if you don't think you're worthy to be in the conversation or you're kind of disengaged. You don't have to stand like you're a drill instructor at attention or something like that, but you do need to stand as though you are comfortable in the space that you're in. Now the final characteristic is equipment, and what I mean by that is anything you're using during the speech, I want to see how comfortable you are using it. For example, if you know that an eventual speech in real life will require a microphone, how comfortable are you working with the microphone? If you're using PowerPoint projections or note cards or a teleprompter, these are all things that are a little bit different, and your comfort level with them will tell the audience a lot about how comfortable you are about the speech itself. So for example, whenever I go to a new classroom that I haven't used before, I usually don't assume that the PowerPoint projector will work. So I bring an additional set of notes, and every now and then I've had to use it. And you better believe that affected the audience. The audience saw that I'd done my preparation in advance and that I had stuff prepared in case the worst occurred. That's the kind of thing that can really communicate to an audience that you have done your homework. So be comfortable with your note cards. If your note cards aren't working for you or your script or outline isn't working for you, then fix them. Go ahead and take the time to improve them so that they'll be more comfortable for you the next time around. So these are the 10 characteristics I'll be focusing on for delivery on both speeches, both the informative and the persuasive. It's just that on the persuasive speech, they're worth 5 times as much. So I'm not going to just leave you there and have you wondering how to handle all that delivery issue. First, remember, you're going to be getting some feedback from me about your delivery on the informative speech and the narrative speech before you even start on this persuasive speech. So that'll help a little bit. But here are some things you should focus on. First, the video process is your friend, and this isn't just unique to the online class. I actually have started using this video process for the persuasive speech in my classes for several reasons. First, I encourage you to take multiple takes. So if you video your speech and then play it back to yourself and decide you want to improve part of it, that's an incredibly valuable way to really honestly assess your own abilities and make improvements. Now, I will be totally honest, you won't like it, but at the same time, you will become a better speaker because of it. That's actually happened to me in the course of making these little videos. As I make these video presentations, I've had to go back and watch every single one of them, and every now and then stop, hit delete on a particular portion, and then start doing the whole section over again. Because every time I do that, I'm able to improve the overall presentation and focus on things that I want to focus on. Now, the final version you turn in has to be one unedited take. You can't, say for example, finish your intro and then first main point and then cut that together with take 7 of point 2 and 3 and then go back to a different one for a conclusion. It needs to be one unedited take. Now, another concern that people have about delivery is that they think that I expect flawless delivery from beginning to end. You've listened to my presentations and you know that I listen to them myself. Do you think I'm expecting you to be absolutely flawless when I'm not? Of course not. It's 6 minutes. You're allowed to make the occasional mistake here or there. It's not like I'm sitting there with the worksheet making little hashtags the second I hear you say for the first time. It's instead that I'm looking for an overall feel. Now, hopefully, when you hear my presentations, you get an overall feel that I know my stuff, that I'm well prepared, that I'm well organized. That's the kind of vibe I'm going for. So what you should do is focus on those parts of your speeches that you think are the most important and really try to nail the delivery for those sections. That's what I'm looking for. A great example of this is how I judge your gestures. It's not like I watch your speech and simply focus on nothing but gestures for 6 minutes and then go back and watch the whole speech again for something else. I'm simply watching the speech. And maybe at minute and 45 seconds into the speech, you use a really powerful, elegant gesture. Cool, that's going to stick out in my memory. It's not that I'm waiting for every single second to be just chock full of gestures. That would be a little worrisome. That'd kind of be weird to watch, somebody gesturing constantly for 6 minutes. So just make it count when it matters. And, most importantly, as I've mentioned a couple times already, if you have trouble giving the speech, pay attention to when you have trouble. That might be you trying to tell yourself something. Say, for example, you might have part of the speech that's just not working very well. It might be time to stop and rethink that particular section or that particular word choice. Or maybe it's a great speech and your note card or outline or script is just causing you trouble. Maybe playing with the font, making it larger, highlighting it, or underlining it. Doing those things will help you. Any musician or artist or actor often does that as they work on their own scripts. That's why, for example, one of the things I always get a kick out of seeing when I go to auctions, even though I'm never able to actually buy anything, is a lot of times at charity auctions, they will have scripts from movies or TV shows that the actors actually used. And then you can go through and you can see the kinds of things that they emphasized or little notes they made to themselves or questions they had. That kind of stuff probably helped them with their memory as well as helped them with their delivery. So, by all means, every time you give the speech, go ahead and mark that script up. That's the kind of thing that will help every new version of the speech get better. But by all means, feel free also to throw me one of those examples. Let's say, for example, 2 days before the actual deadline, you want to give it a test run. Feel free to shoot me a version of it and I can tell you how I feel about it. I won't pre-grade it, right? I won't respond as if, hey, that's a B. I'll simply say, yeah, I think your delivery is working well there. Or you might want to go one more take on this particular element. That's the kind of thing that I'll give you feedback on. But feel free to ask me about any of that. For the delivery characteristic, this speech is the primary goal we've got going, and that's the one that I want to pay more attention to as we deliver this assignment. Now remember, this isn't something that's unique to the video. This is actually something that I do in my regular class. Students are allowed in the regular version of this class to turn in a video version instead of deliver the speech in class. So this isn't something unique to you guys. This is actually exactly how I normally teach the speech. So I'm comfortable doing it. Let me know if you've got questions, and by all means, try to think of a topic that fits both of these types of speeches so you will save yourself some work and effort. Take care, folks.